Welcome to our Friday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today is the end of my first week teaching through the life of Joseph. I've got a new book, first time we've ever released this, entitled Lessons from Joseph. You know, I've got another teaching on Lessons from Elijah and another one entitled Lessons from David. And so this is Lessons from Joseph, and I tell you, I just love Joseph. God has spoken some powerful things to me through his life. And I used the very first day of this week talking about 1 Corinthians 10, 6 through 11, that the reason all of these things were written in the Bible is for our learning, that we may learn through them, not to make the same mistakes that they made, and then to emulate them on the things that they did right. If you don't follow the leadership of the people in the Bible that were written about, well, then you are destined to have to learn all of these things through your own hard knocks. There's a better way. I've also got this little booklet that is a 50-page booklet that's a brief summary of this teaching, and we're giving this away as a gift. With nothing requested for that, and for the book we're asking for a donation of any amount. And then we have CDs and DVDs and a USB on this teaching, and we'll give out all that information at the end of today's program. So we've already covered a lot of material this week. We talked in Genesis chapter 37 about how Joseph had these two dreams that instilled a hope in him, a vision for his future, which was going to be needed because he was going to go through a lot of bad things. His brothers hated him. They tried to kill him, and one of the brothers, Reuben, saved them from killing him, but then the other brothers still sold him into slavery. So here's this boy who was the favorite son of a very rich man. He went from being, just pampered in every way to sold into slavery. And I mentioned this on yesterday's program, but I love this verse in Genesis 39:2. It says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man." That's talking about when he was being sold into slavery. God saw him prosperous, even though in the natural there was nothing prosperous about him. It looked like his life was over. Did you know that you can get God's opinion of you, God's vision of you, and what he wants to do through you in the future, and you can let that encourage you and keep you strong, even when everything in the natural looks completely contrary to that. Man, that is one powerful truth. And because Joseph kept a good attitude, you don't find people who are just depressed and discouraged and bitter and angry acting the way Joseph did. So his very actions here show you that even though his brothers had forsaken him, even though he was sold into slavery, even though it looked like his life was over in the natural, he continued to believe God, and he held on to those dreams that God had given him, and he served his master, and he was so successful that his master promoted him to being Lord over his whole house. He didn't know anything about his finances, his business deals. It says he didn't know anything that was going on except what he ate. That's how much he trusted Joseph. He put Joseph in charge of his entire household and all of the other slaves. Boy, that speaks volumes. That speaks volumes. A depressed, defeated person, a person who's murmuring and complaining, does not get promoted that way. So this shows us that Joseph was still holding on to his integrity. He was still serving God, and he was serving his master. He could have been bitter towards him, thinking, I used to be the one who had slaves. Now I'm a slave. And he could have been bitter towards his master, and yet he wasn't. But just because he was doing the right thing doesn't mean that the devil's going to leave you alone. Now the devil came at Joseph through the master's wife, and she tempted him and said, lie with me. That's the last part of verse 7. And in verse 8, but he refused. Joseph refused and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wanteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in his house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Boy, there is some powerful things here that the Lord spoke to me. There's two things I want to point out. I could spend more time on this, but first of all, he recognized the honor and the authority that had been given him by Potiphar. And you know, again, if he was a bitter person, he could have said, I'm a slave and he's my master, and he could have hated him And yet that's not what he did. He served him and he honored his master, and he was not going to sin against his master. Did you know today there are so many people that, America, well, the whole world has had a history of slavery. And in America, there was a lot of slaves. And there are people that look back and just think that you're supposed to hate any person that ever had slaves. And yet in the Bible, it says that Paul gave command to slaves to serve their masters without grudging and without, being a man pleaser. In other words, you do it as heartily as unto the Lord. And yet there's some people today that, man, if somebody was to treat them unjustly, they feel justified in hating that person, slandering that person, doing anything to that person. That's not a godly attitude. Now, that's not to say that every situation God wants you to just submit to it, but there are right and wrong ways to do things. And you see here Joseph submitting to his master, and he would not take advantage of his master. He said this would be a sin against his master, and he wouldn't do it. Did you know he could have gotten by with it? The wife wasn't going to tell on him because it would have been her own neck that would have been on the chopping block. He could have rationalized. If he would have been like many people today, there's people watching this program that bad things happen to you and that just makes you so bitter that in your eyes it justifies you going out and rioting and breaking windows and doing things, setting cars on fire, stuff like that, and you just think that you deserve it because you've been mistreated. Joseph had been mistreated, but he wasn't going to do those kind of things. He could have gotten by with having sex with the master's wife because she wouldn't have told on him. He could have looked at it as, I deserve it. Look at all the bad things that have happened to me. Here's an opportunity for me to indulge my flesh. But see, he was being faithful to that master. Man, that speaks volumes about Joseph. And then the thing that really speaks to me the most out of this, after he talked about being faithful to Potiphar and not violating Potiphar, then he said in the latter part of this 9th verse, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? That's the bottom line. You need to honor people. You need to be faithful to the people who've entrusted you and given you a position. If you're working for somebody, you don't need to take an extra 10 minutes on breaks. You need to honor that employee. You don't need to steal pencils and pens and little things that you think that you can get by with. That's not being faithful. You need to serve that person that you're working for the same as if you were the boss. But the bottom line is, how could you do this great wickedness and sin against God? When I was in Vietnam, there was a guy that I grew up with. We weren't real close, but we went to church together. We were in school together. We had known each other our whole life, and both of us got drafted. Both of us were in Vietnam at the same time. And I tell you, in Vietnam, there was a lot of pressure on you. There was a pressure to be accepted. Everybody was doing drugs. Everybody was drinking. And they would have what they called a stand down, and like every 90 days or so, they would take the troops out of the field and put you into a rear area and bring in these Filipino showgirls, and they would dance, and they were actually prostitutes. And after the show was over, you could have as much sex as you wanted. The government would give you as much booze as you wanted. Everybody got totally wasted during these 3 days of stand down. And even though, man, that was not what I wanted to do, there was a draw to be a part of what everybody else was doing. And as far as I know, I was the only person out of 200 people in my battalion, I guess it was. I was the only person that didn't participate. And you know what? This other friend of mine that I grew up with, he had basically the same values that I had. He grew up the same way, and yet he participated. And he got sucked into all of that stuff. And I can tell you, part of the reasoning was people were thinking, well, who's going to know? If you were back here in the States and if you were having sexual relations with somebody outside of marriage, you might think about, how's this going to reflect on my family or something like that. But in Vietnam, I was the only person out of 200 people that didn't do this. Nobody was going to criticize me. There's no way that it would ever come back to my family. And it looked like I could get by with it. But you know the thing that kept me from doing that? If it would have only been my desire to, just blend in and be a part and be accepted by people, I'd have given in to that. But the thing that kept me from doing that was the fact that I had a relationship with God, a real vital relationship with God. And it didn't matter what people said. People made fun of me. People criticized me. I had people that get so upset I'd go sit down, when I got my food in a mess hall, and all of the people around me would just get up and move. They treated me like the plague. They called me preacher and they joked about me and stuff like that. And even though I didn't like that and I didn't enjoy those things, I guarantee you it was my relationship with the Lord that kept me from doing that. I actually spoke at a Christian high school one time. There was about 600 people in this high school, and they had me speak to their classes. And while I was waiting to be introduced, I just picked up one of their brochures, and on the brochure it said positive peer pressure. And as I read it, this was the main thing that they were advertising, that kids, love to be accepted. God made us for acceptance. I believe any person that likes rejection, something's wrong with you. God made us for fellowship. And so there's something inside of every person that wants to be accepted. And because of this, kids will often be pressured into experimenting with drugs, alcohol, sex, and things like this that they really don't want to do. It's not the way they were raised, but peer pressure will cause them to do it. So this Christian school was advertising as one of their greatest promotion pieces, positive peer pressure. Because it was a Christian school and most of the kids there loved God, well then you were under pressure to live a godly life instead of to go out and experiment with drugs and alcohol, etc. And I understood the point that they were making, but I firmly believe that that's still wrong. You are teaching those kids to conform to peer pressure. And because it's positive peer pressures that might help them through high school or whatever, but what happens when they get sent into battle? Like I was over in Vietnam and I was the only person that didn't submit. If I would have been trained, even with positive peer pressure, but if I was taught to give in to peer pressure, I guarantee you I would have committed all of the atrocities that everybody else did. But it was because of my personal relationship with the Lord. You shouldn't be training your kids to, have peer pressure. Yes, you can use positive peer pressure. Yes, they need to have godly friends, and I wouldn't just expose them to all the negative peer pressure, but man, it needs to go far beyond that. And see, I get that from Joseph. Joseph was in a situation where probably everybody else around him was living this way. Probably all of the other slaves in Potiphar's house, if they would have been presented with the opportunity to have sex with the master's wife, that would have moved them up the ladder, and the master's wife wouldn't have exposed what was happening, and most everybody else would have taken advantage of it. But Joseph did it because, number one, he honored Potiphar. He was actually committed to doing what was right for him, and he was honoring the person who was over him. But the bottom line is, how could he do this great wickedness and sin against God? Man, that's powerful. You need to get to a place to when nobody's looking, you're still going to do what's right because of your relationship with God. There's not very many people that their relationship with God is deep enough to cause that to be the primary directive in their life. I read a thing in Reader's Digest that they took a billfold and put $100 in it, but they also had a person's name, they had contact information, phone number, everything in there, and then they put this billfold in front of a place where there was a lot of traffic, and they had a hidden camera and people that were hiding, and they watched to see what people would do. And they said out of all of those people that saw this wallet, they did this over and over and over, there was like 80 or 90% of the people that would look inside, see the money, see the contact information, and then they would look to see if anybody was watching. And if nobody was watching, they would just take off and take the money. And then they would stop them and say, there was contact information, we planted this, why didn't you make an effort to contact the person? And nearly every single person says, well, I thought about it, but I looked and it didn't look like anybody was going to hold me accountable, I could get away with it. And so they have situational ethics. It all depends on whether or not they're going to be caught, whether or not they're going to be punished for it or not. See, that's not the way you're supposed to live your life. You need to recognize that whether anybody else knows, whether anybody else is watching, God is with you constantly. The Lord knows every single thing. It says in Psalms 139 that there is not even a thought that you have in your head, but what God knows every single thought that you have. You need to get to where you live your life in total, just being open and available to the Lord, recognizing that you don't have a Christian part of your life and then a secular part of your life. You need to get to where God is the number one thing in your life. And I'm speaking to the potential of 5.2 billion people. There's probably millions, multiple millions of people watching this. And out of all of those millions, I would suspect that the vast majority of you, and again, I'm not saying this to be mean, I'm just saying it to make my point, that the vast majority of you do not live your life that way. It just depends. If you had to, bend the truth in order to be able to sell your product, if you have to stab somebody else in the back, take advantage of somebody else to get a promotion in your business, and on, it just depends on what the costs are as to what you would do. And that's the wrong way to live. John Adams said that duty is ours and results are the Lord's. And he was the first vice president, the second president of the United States, and he was talking about the Revolutionary War, and it was in response to somebody saying, "Do you think we're going to win?" And he basically was saying, it doesn't matter whether we win or not. We've got to do the right thing. And then duty is ours, results are the Lord's. I had some people talk about that they felt like the election with Trump and Biden was stolen. And because of that, they feel like, what's the use in voting? And I actually had David and Tim Barton on my program, and we were addressing this very issue. And there was a person that called in, what's the point in voting? If our votes aren't going to be counted right, if they're going to stack the deck, if this Dominion voting system is skewing the vote, what's the point in even trying? And boy, I thought David Barton's answer was just tremendous, because he says, God is going to hold you accountable for you doing the right thing. And if other people, even if your vote never counted, you are going to be held accountable for the fact that you are given this privilege, this right, this responsibility to vote. And whether or not other people overwhelm it or whatever, God, you're going to have to answer for God for what did you do. See, that's his same attitude. Whether what you do is rewarded or rebuffed, it doesn't matter. You need to do what's right. And this is what Joseph did. And this is one of the things that makes me admire him so much, is that he didn't consider what the consequences were going to be. He did what was right regardless of the consequences. I had a man just come to me yesterday, and he's one of our students, and he works at Walmart. And Walmart allows the transgender people to go into whichever restroom they feel like. Well, this man works at Walmart. His wife also works at Walmart, and he refuses to let some of these transgender go into the women's restroom. And he sits there and he defends and protects his wife when she goes to the restroom. He's an ex-military guy, and he's not going to let this happen. And because of it, he's possibly going to be fired. And he was asking me, what do I do? And I basically was telling him the same thing. You have to do what's right. And that doesn't matter what the results are. If it gets you fired, then get fired. God will reward you. God will take care of you. There's no person that gives up anything for his sake, is what it says in Mark chapter 10, verses 29 and 30. There's nobody who gives up anything for the Lord's sake, but what you will receive 100-fold in this life. Not just in the one to come, but in this life. If you wind up doing the right thing and you lose your job, I guarantee you God will bless you and prosper you, and you'll come out better on the other side. We need to get rid of evaluating whether we should do something on what the consequences are going to be. You need to just evaluate on, is this going to please God? Is this what God wants me to do? And if it pleases God, then you do it. I don't care if it hair-lips the devil. I don't care what the results is. And you know, this is exactly what I did during the COVID thing. We submitted for a brief period of time because President Trump said just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And we didn't know where this was going. I didn't know. And so anyway, I obeyed for a short period of time. But then I just recognized that they were just going to milk this thing and extend it. And they did not have the right. You know, our facility, we could accommodate 5,000 people in different places with closed circuit. And they only allowed me to, I think, 75 people in our whole deal. And I just wrote the governor and I said, no way. I said, I'm not submitting. And he threatened to arrest me, and he threatened to come and take away my 501c3. They threatened to put me in jail. We had people come here and treat us like we were criminals. And my wife says, I hate this, and I hated it too. But you know what? This is exactly what drives me right here. What is the right thing to do? If you empower government and submit to them and give them authority that they don't have, that the Constitution doesn't have, I guarantee you they aren't going to just turn around and give it back to you. You have to take a stand. And so I stood because it was the right thing, and it was possible that it could have ended our ministry, it could have put me in jail, it could have done a lot of things. And I didn't like any of those options, but you know, I just was, what am I going to do? I am committed to doing what's right. And I'm going to do what's right. I don't care what the results are. That's what Joseph did. I get that from Joseph. You don't have to wait until you're in a crisis situation and they're threatening to fire you if you don't comply with their DEI and all of this CRT stuff. You don't have to wait and make your decision then. You can make your decision right now that, God, I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to speak the truth. I am not going to live a lie. I'm not going to call a man by his preferred female name. I'm not going to do that. That's validating a lie. I'm not going to do those kind of things. You can make a decision way before you come into that situation that you're just going to do what's right. And whatever the results are, duty is yours, results are God's. And I tell you, it's a great way to live. You don't have to sit there and agonize over things. What should I do? I'm just going to do what God told me to do. I'm going to live by the Word of God. I'm going to live by truth. I'm not going to embrace a lie. I will not promote a lie. I want to thank you for watching our YouTube channel and the programs that we have available, and I want to encourage you that you can get the materials that we've offered. Also, I'd like to encourage you to like our program and subscribe to what we're doing. We have a lot of material, and I believe it'll be a real blessing to you. So thank you for being a part of it. God bless you.